I'd said last class session that we were pretty much finished with Catholicism in the grand pageant history of American culture, but that's not entirely true, because the last chapter that actually deals with it is this chapter on the religion of Spanish-speaking peoples, and why did they separate them out from other ethnicities who were closely connected with Catholicism? What was the point of that? Just to follow along census lines? You know, most of the ethnicities associated with Roman Catholics are counted as white according to the U.S. Census, and then we have this category of Hispanic, Latino, changes names every so often. Is that why they did it? Or is there a different, better academic reason for putting it off to a different chapter? He gives some justification of this. He also talks about the problem with even speaking of Hispanic or Latino in terms of ethnicity. What are some of the problems with that? I mean, we've talked about this before in other classes with the weird ways in which we define race or ethnicity here in the United States, so that people as disparate as, for example, people from the Middle East get lumped under white, and then if you just move a little bit further east, you'll be in this gigantic category of Asian, technically South Asian, even though they may look a lot, live a lot, have a lot in common with each other. We have these really strange dividing lines. Why is this particularly a problem for Hispanic or Latino designations? Yeah.
You can't lump them into one color because of the diversity of many Latinos, but at the same time, they're not all Spanish-speaking, which makes it very strange, because we got Brazil, which is Portuguese.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a big question about whether they should be considered a separate category. Sometimes, Latino, Latin descendant languages. Why not include the French Canadians then?
Or Spaniards are considered in this Hispanic category, but they're not white.
Yeah, there's a lot of weird, vague things with this. And then, immigration has produced these centers where there are Hispanics who don't speak Spanish at all. So if you're going to define it in terms of language, that makes it a little bit questionable. You're right, you can't associate it with race because there's a mixture of European ancestry, African ancestry, Native American ancestry, and the Native American ancestry may vary considerably depending on what area we're talking about. It's not as if Incans from, say, Peru have exactly the same genes as Navajos. There's a lot of genetic diversity as well. Your book mainly just talks about 3 areas. And why do they concentrate on those? Well, because the bulk of immigration to the United States of Spanish-speaking people has come either from Mexico or from Puerto Rico or from Cuba. But what are some of the other important areas that we could have included if they wanted to make this chapter more comprehensive? Yeah.
New York City has a lot of Dominicans.
That's a surprise not to see that in here, isn't it?
Puerto Ricans do outnumber Dominicans, though, so I guess they chose those 3.
But they're very different, right? You call a Dominican a Puerto Rican, and that's not going to go over too well, or vice versa. Who else? So that's a Caribbean country, sort of like Puerto Rico or Cuba, yeah.
Other South American countries are also represented. A lot of recent immigration, not just from Mexico, but much of South America.
Yeah, like
Salvador, Peru,
yeah.
Colombia, Venezuela.
Panama, a lot of military spouses and immigration from Panama. So, you know, could what they're saying here be generalized to include all these other peoples? You'd have to stretch it a bit. One of the other things that I want to start with, and we're kind of jumping around a little bit in the chapter, we're dealing with a different cultural matrix than Anglo-America. And when I say Anglo-America, I mean, you know, the United States and Canada, which were not completely dominated by English speakers, but were pretty much dominated by them. And which, as we've seen in our story, Catholics were a minority, and sometimes an oppressed minority within. Eventually they become part of the mainstream. We've already gone over all of that story. What's different in the rest of the Americas? Actually, the bulk of the Americas, right? Because we're, other than this sort of little English-speaking fringe at the top, most of the Americas are either Spanish-speaking or Brazilian Portuguese-speaking, overlaid over a whole matrix of all sorts of Native American languages and cultures. So what are the inheritances that are coming? What's relevant from Spanish colonial days? Because they do kick the Spanish out pretty early in the story. But just changing, you know, who's in charge doesn't always change the culture. So what was the dominant religion? Yeah.
Roman Catholicism.
Okay, so the Catholic Church dominant religion. Oftentimes there were clashes between, and we've talked about this before, between representatives of the Catholic Church and state authorities. As a matter of fact, the Jesuits actually down in Paraguay managed to raise a mercenary army to fight against both the Portuguese and the Spanish, who were horribly oppressing the Native Americans down there. What else? What else is important to keep in mind? Did the Spaniards just come in and build a bunch of churches and everybody said, all right, we're all Catholic? Is that the way it works when you conquer somebody? Think about some of our recent conquests. You know, the United States is great at taking over territories. We don't seem to be so great, and nobody is actually, at changing territories that we take over. Have we fundamentally changed the culture, the situation of some of the countries that we've, you know, occupied recently? Minor ways, right? We changed the governments, yeah.
A lot of what Spain did was resource extraction, so they didn't have a lot of Spaniards settling in these countries.
Yeah. So what's the impact of that?
They were able to retain more of their indigenous culture than, say, in the United States, where there was a lot of assimilation.
Yeah. Or just pushing them out completely. So Native American cultures, let's just use the word adapt. There is some, you know, just complete destruction in some places. But there is a lot of sort of adaptation, and we use the word fusion. At the same time, from Spain, quite a few of these people bring a number of what we can call folk religion, customs, and institutions. A lot of, you know, a sort of oversimplistic view on the relationship between official Catholicism and then this folk religion that gets practiced would be, well, the official Catholicism comes from the Spanish, and then the folk Catholicism, the folk stuff is all coming from Native Americans. But really, it's not quite so simple as that. A lot of the Spaniards are bringing some of these peasant customs from Europe as well. Similar to what was going on in rural France or rural Italy or in southern Italy. Another thing that's really important to keep in mind is what your book calls kind of ambivalence. Oh, I wonder ambivalence about church-state relations. It would be tempting to say, well, you know, in Catholic countries, the Catholic Church runs the show. It's the official religion. They're all subject to the Pope. But if you actually look at the history of how things went, quite often you have church and state at odds with each other and representing different classes of society, representing different interests. Later on, there's all these revolutions. Throughout, they kicked the Spaniards out by having all these revolutions, and the church, you know, was not always on what was felt to be the right side. So there could be, you know, quite a bit of animosity against the church. As a matter of fact, when we think of secularism, some of the governments that we're talking about, for example, in Mexico in the 1900s, were intensely secular, were intensely anti-clerical. They're against the practice of religion. They suppressed it in some cases. So this is all stuff to sort of, you know, put into the big picture thing. Now your book then talks about each of these groups in turn, spends most of its time on Mexicans, admittedly. And it says the cultural, social, and religious experience that Mexican immigrants have brought with them is very different than other Catholics for these sorts of reasons. Right? And it talks about the inability of the church and the state to nurture an indigenous leadership. It was always sort of top down. It wasn't very participatory. So, what's the result of all this? This is a profound national ambivalence about organized Catholicism. On the one hand, it remained part of the fabric of national life. It's hard to think of Mexico without, in a concrete way, without thinking about Catholicism. Despite opposition from the government and intelligentsia, on the other hand, many ordinary practitioners found themselves unable to identify completely with what remained sort of an alien imposed religion. There's also an emergence of a folk religion that sort of coexists with the formal structures and teaching of the church. Your book gives some examples of this folk religion. The Virgin of Guadalupe. How many of you have ever seen like an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe? Only a few of you? Okay. Look it up online. It's worth checking out. There's a whole long story there about Juan Diego and about, you know, how this manifested itself. The real importance of the story is that this is a way in which the underclass, the ones who've been conquered, can sort of reappropriate Catholic imagery and make it their own. This is one of the interesting things about Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. So really, you know, Christianity that goes back to the early church and all these sort of traditions, is that you've got, you know, Our Lady of this, Our Lady of that, Our Lady of this. Why does that occur? Well, because it allows people to have a sort of local expression of how they view important figures. Now, your book talks about some other examples of this as well, about faith healing, about these votive images, and then it talks about some rituals. And one of the rituals that's particularly easy to relate to, I think in part because so much attention has been paid to it in the media in the last 10 years, is a quinceanera. So what is a quinceanera supposed to be? Is it just a extra bash that Mexican kids get to have? You know, a lot of white girls have started doing quinceaneras. Sort of like a lot of non-Jewish kids actually do bar and bat mitzvahs. It tends to upset Orthodox Jews quite a bit that happens. supposed to be about? Sweet 15, so you get the, maybe you get the car, but you can't drive it yet? Yeah.
It's supposed to be for a girl, transition between girlhood and womanhood.
Yeah, so remember how we've talked at a number of points about rituals and their importance, and one of the key changes in time is going from being a child to being an adult. Now notice some of the aspects of it that sometimes get left out. There's a vow that's taken, a vow of chastity until marriage. So it's a reaffirmation done in its traditional setting of religious values. Your book also talks about these lay fraternities, these penitential brotherhoods that occurred as well. I'm going to skip over the discussion about how immigration took place in the United States. One thing that your book does talk about is that, so there have been, in a certain sense, two ethnic Catholicisms in the United States. You have the sort of Americanizing, let's take the Germans, the Italians, the Polish, make them all part of one thing, usually the Irish kind of on top. And then this massive Spanish-speaking immigration into the United States. And they didn't really fuse that well together until really from the 1960s on, when they start to pay attention to the fact that they need some representation. There's a Bishops' Commission for the Spanish-speaking, a Catholic organization aimed at the concerns of Hispanics. This is pretty important demographically because they're one of the few ethnicities, the few traditional Catholic ethnicities, that still is growing in the United States. So that's where a lot of church growth is going to be occurring. Your book then starts talking about Puerto Rico, and it points out one major difference between Puerto Rico and all the other places we're talking about. It's actually part of the United States in some sense. Right? Should it be a state? Is it a territory? Should it remain a territory? Whatever however you parse that out, one of the really important upshots of that, usually when we think about immigration, you move from here, where you're a citizen or a resident, over here, and you become part of this nation here. Puerto Rican immigration can go back and forth, just like, say, Texan immigration. If we want to consider Texans, some Texans almost seem to consider themselves, or talk about themselves as having a distinct ethnicity. You could look at it in the same way. They go somewhere else, they come back. But in this case, we're talking about a small island, so it's much more homogenous, that experience, rather than one of the largest states of the nation. So your book talks about some of the differences in terms of the ethnic mix. But one of the more important points is that during most of the colonial period, Puerto Rico was largely isolated from the rest of the Spanish Empire. It underwent something different by becoming an American territory. You have these Protestant missionaries coming in, trying to carry out Americanization. So although Catholics, like it says, are an overwhelming majority of the island's population, a tradition of folk religion, an alienation from American church leadership, and highly independent culture have worked against any strong official church influence. Then they talk about Cuba. Why did Cuba become important? It makes sense that Puerto Ricans would immigrate to the United States because they get to pretty easily. Mexican immigration was driven in some part by agricultural migrant workers, but then very quickly developed into all these sort of outposts and towns. The town that I grew up in Wisconsin, Waukesha, actually had about 1/3 of the population was Mexican in one way or the other. Either recent immigrants, which were very few, or they'd been there for a long time. It was one of those sort of outpost towns, you might call it. Why did the Cubans wind up here? Yeah.
They're refugees.
Yeah, and that, refugees from what? Because that's what really changes the tenor.
The government, right? The wealthier classes, like in Cuba.
Yeah. Now, why did the wealthier people, their taxes got too high, and they said, well, the hell with this, like some other people do? Yeah.
The social regime began to take away property and assets from the rich people.
Yeah, I mean, Cuba was a hardcore communist regime that was actually trying to export revolution everywhere else. They were involved in Nicaragua, they'd go over to Africa and fight proxy wars. They were serious about this. So a lot of the upper class, the upper middle class, they leave Cuba. And they bring along with them, whatever wealth they can. And they bring along with them not only sort of their religion, their customs, but also a kind of conservatism that goes along with being from the propertied classes. Your book talks about the importance of Little Havana in Miami and Dade County and why that's so central. So they said the anti-communist motivation for this endeared these newcomers to the American government because we were heavily anti-communist at the time, and the Catholic Church in a way not experienced by these other immigrants. The result has been a creation of a politically and economically powerful enclave centered around Dade County. Middle class, politically conservative, supportive of institutional Catholicism, the Cubans of South Florida share little in common with their fellow Latinos other than the Spanish language and a formal attachment to the Catholic Church. So we already have considerable diversity in the story here. Now, how do we wrap this story up? Your book brings up some really interesting recent developments that we should probably, it's not an inheritance from Spanish Catholicism, it's something fairly recent. The Catholic Church is not the only game in town in Latin America or South America, the way that you could have said that it was 100 years ago. Who else has come in? Who else is starting to take a stake, other than people just becoming secular and saying, forget religion, forget the church? Yeah.
Mormonism and Islam is really gaining a lot of people in Latin America.
Yeah, I mean, not to the extent that this other group that I'm thinking about is.
Protestantism also is being grown.
What's that?
Protestantism.
Yeah, and when we're thinking about Protestantism, it's going to be mostly very conservative groups, quite often Pentecostal Protestants. It's not the mainline Protestants who are growing, because they're not growing anywhere, actually. Their numbers are just sort of shrinking away. They have some real demographic problems. But within Latin America and South America, there are a lot of evangelicals and a lot of Pentecostals that are carrying out mission work, and have been for several generations. That's having an effect on Spanish-speaking people in America, in the United States itself, on the religious landscape there. So you can find quite a few. If you go around to Spanish-speaking neighborhoods, you'll generally find Catholic churches, and then you'll also find some of these as well. Yeah.
Yeah, in Puerto Rico, in town, they will have like plaza where the main center is the Catholic Church, and then sometimes in some towns right next to it is a Protestant church. My family often jokes like if you get divorced, you go to the Protestant church to get married.
Because you can't. It's hard to get an annulment, and yeah.